It is the time to do it now because Israeli and Palestinian societies, they don't know each other anymore. They've been siloed. And we're never going to get to a two-state solution. We're never going to get to peace if we don't build those bridges between civil societies.
That's the voice of Yara Sachs, Canada's Minister of Mental Health and Addictions. She's the first Israeli Canadian to sit in Parliament. She's a self-declared proud Zionist. Now, that clip of her comes from an interview she did with me on the CJN Daily back in the spring of 2021, just after the short war between Israel and Hamas had ended in May, and she was explaining how she had pushed the government to donate $5 million towards confidence-building programs that would help Israelis and Palestinians get to know each other. Fast forward to this past week, when she wasn't saying anything about a photo that was published on the official Twitter account of Canada's Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly. It showed Joly shaking hands with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas at his headquarters in Ramallah on the West Bank. It also showed Sachs standing on his other side, smiling and holding hands with him. The two Canadian politicians were on a diplomatic swing through the West Bank and Israel as the war with Hamas enters its 24th week, and over 100 Israeli hostages are still being held in Gaza. You've heard about this photo. It sparked a furor because it shows Sachs meeting with one of Israel's biggest enemies. The photo op comes on the heels of a series of moves that the Canadian government has now taken in recent days, moves that many Jewish Canadians see as anti-Israel, and some say even reward the terrorists for the October 7th attacks. And all of that comes ahead of a key policy vote scheduled for later today in the House of Commons, as the NDP asks Canada to unilaterally recognize Palestine as a state.
If you're making a political calculus, it just so happens that they have a lot to lose by being perceived as being overly pro-Israel, and a lot to gain in some respects, depending on your perspective and depending on the political analysis you're making for the medium to long term, by being seen as being much more critical and more pro-Palestinian.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, March the 18th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, and we're sponsored by Metropia. Yara Sachs didn't reply to our requests for an interview about that photo with her and Mahmoud Abbas, but on her own social media posts the next day, she was unapologetic. She's not giving up on her nearly 30 years of working towards peace for Israelis and Palestinians, she says, no matter how hard that might be right now to see a path forward. And she wants a safe and secure Israel and two states for two people, but Hamas must release the hostages, lay down its arms, and stop using people in Gaza as human shields. What's behind the photo and the upcoming vote in Parliament? And what about Canada resuming funding for UNRWA, blocking export permits for military equipment for Israel, and even announcing Canada's giving $1 million to investigate sexual violence that Israelis may have committed against Palestinians? Then there's the sanctioning of extremist settlers, calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, and Trudeau warning Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu not to invade Rafah. Well, joining me now with their takes are three political insiders who are no stranger to us here at the CJN. Anthony Kosh is a Montrealer who was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's speechwriter. He's currently still a Conservative Party insider and runs his own strategy firm. Emma Cunningham is a CJN Daily political panel regular, a former NDP riding president in Ontario who quit over her party's failure to deal with systemic anti-Semitism. And Joe Roberts is formerly with J-Space Canada. He's a supporter of Yara Sachs. He's now managing director with Winston Wilmot, which is a political strategy firm. It's great to have you all together. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, thanks for inviting us.
I must have gotten 40 different emails this week from CJA, from B'nai B'rith, from my rabbi, from any organization to vote no, vote no. Here's the list of all the MPPs. Vote no. Here's their phone numbers. We'll go around and we'll talk specifically about this NDP motion, which is being debated Monday in the House of Commons. Who thinks that there are some things that Jews could support in there? I put my hand up for a few things that make sense, but let's start with you, Joe, because you just wrote a scathing article in our competitor, the National Post, about this motion.
Well, look, Ellen, I think you said it right. I mean, there are many things in this that the Jewish community can support. Humanitarian aid increased to Gaza, of course. Releasing all hostages, of course. it gets complicated from there, right? First of all, if you look at the way that the motion begins, it kind of makes some assumptions, right? Lays out what is the state of play before it goes into what the motion calls for. Some of the things that it says in the state of play are just factually incorrect, are Hamas propaganda that are being recycled through this motion, and others are just problematic, right? Once we get into what the actual motion is requesting, I mean, there are two big things that I think the community is going to take issue with. One is, when we talk about release all hostages, let's talk about all caps on all. Don Davies, a NDP MP from BC, put a tweet out with a graphic saying, release all the hostages. Someone commented, does this mean Palestinian hostages as well? And he said, of course it does. It means all hostages. So what he's actually doing is equating prisoners in Israeli prisons who've committed or supported terrorism to children, the elderly, infants who are being held hostage, who have no recourse, right? Even under administrative detention, which you can take issue with all you want, and that is a legitimate political issue to take. You can actually criticize Israel on that without being anti-Semitic, if that's possible these days. But even under administrative detention, these prisoners have the ability to see a lawyer. They have the ability to let their families know they're alive, to have medications and healthcare. None of that is afforded to the prisoner or to the hostages in Gaza today, right? And then the other big thing I would say is unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood. Of course, it's been longstanding policy, 50 years of the Canadian government of looking towards a two-state solution, but through a negotiated, settled peace. This obliterates that. It completely gets rid of the aspect of needing to come to an agreement and says, we will recognize you unilaterally today, which serves as a trophy, a reward for Hamas violence on October 7th.
So, Anthony, you're either rocking or you're nodding.
I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find Canadian Jews that are 150% opposed to the idea that innocent Gazans should be receiving greater humanitarian aid that's delivered in the appropriate fashion, such that it's not just, we see even recently a lot of these airdrops of care packages that are being dropped in, they're being taken by Hamasniks and then sold to Palestinian civilians. So it's not even actually getting directly to the population. But I'm saying at the macro level, people support the idea that innocent civilians should not be forced to suffer consequences because Hamas has decided to engage in atrocities and horrific attacks on Israeli civilians as well. But the two sticking points, for my particular purposes, I think that the most egregious one is the unilateral recognition of the Palestinian state. At the end of the day, geopolitics is very complicated, but in some respects, it's actually quite simple. Reward good behavior, punish bad behavior, and don't do the inverse. And stuff starts to get very dicey when you start to do the inverse. And the fact of the matter is, if the response in the end, 5-6 months after October 7th, is for countries like Canada to unilaterally recognize the existence of a Palestinian state, the only message that will be received, not only by Hamas, but also by equivalent and similar groups elsewhere in the world, is that the kind of violence and atrocities that were committed on October 7th are an effective means of accomplishing political goals, when the response should be the exact opposite. Is the goal to work towards the establishment of a Palestinian state? Like Joe said, that's long-standing Canadian foreign policy, bipartisan, regardless of whether we're talking about conservative governments or liberal governments. But the context under which that recognition occurs is extraordinarily important. The context of this matters immensely, and to do it right now sends all the wrong messages, I think, is beyond the pale. Comparing innocent women and children abducted from their homes, old folks abducted from their homes, minding their business, or far from being anything close to combatants, to people that have been convicted of, in many cases, murdering Israelis, trying to murder Israeli civilians, or, being potential terrorist failed self-bombers or terrorist attacks, etc., is absolutely beyond the pale. And just goes to show you the kind of false equivalencies that people make, not only in this particular circumstance, but in terms of the conflict in general. So it's sad. And the way that it's even being sold, you see a lot of the NDP MPs have been out publishing it, saying about the need to support a ceasefire. That's the only thing that this motion is about, right? Just the war to stop. Glossing over, I think deliberately, some of the more specific details that are included, in order to make it seem as if anybody who opposes this motion just wants the conflict to go and doesn't support aid to innocent Gazan civilians. I hope that the motion fails, but I am not particularly positive. And I think we're going to see on almost unilateral or universal, I should say, NDP support for this motion. I think we're going to see the majority of the Liberal caucus in one way or another come out and support. We'll see where the bloc goes, but I didn't think we were going to get here 5 months ago.
Emma, I know you're no longer with the NDP, but tell me what you think is going to happen with this motion, and why do you think they brought it forward this way?
Yeah, I mean, I left the NDP over anti-Semitism, right? And I'm not going to get into that too much because people can Google Emma Cunningham and CJN and hear all about it. But no, this is not out of character. It's not out of character for the NDP. And that's why I'm no longer with the party. You know, I laugh because both Anthony and Joe talked about how, despite the fact that we are three people on very different political spectrums, as is the Jewish community as a whole, we've all come together over this, and I can't disagree with anything that they've said. You know, I find that for me, as far as this motion goes, I feel the same way about it that I do any omnibus bill or any omnibus motion. There's things in there I like. There's things in there that I don't. For me, what's missing from this is the how. And I think the how is really important as far as me making any kind of decision about how I feel about each individual thing. Do I want us to recognize a Palestinian state? 1,000%. Okay, great. How are we going to achieve that? Are we just going to put up our hands and say, great, Palestine is Palestine now? Or are we going to negotiate something where it comes out without Israel dying? Do we want to have a ceasefire? Absolutely. But we had one on October 6th. So what's going to make this one any different? How are we going to achieve any of these things? And I think it's also important to mention that this motion is non-binding. So if it passes, that still doesn't mean that the government has to go ahead with any of this. So whereas I do think a lot of the Liberals will vote in favor of this motion, I don't know that Trudeau will. In fact, I don't think he will. I don't think he's going to support this motion. So we'll see if my expectations are met or shattered. And I think we're going to have to go from there.
Is it true? Did you hear, I'm interrupting for a second, that over the weekend, Candace Malcolm from True North tweeted that the Liberals are getting free vote. What do you know about that? Emma, start with you.
Yeah, I think that's great. One of the reasons I would never run for provincial or federal politics is I couldn't stand having my vote whipped. So the more that we allow people to vote with their consciences, in my opinion, that's better, because we don't just elect a party, we elect local representatives, and I like to see them get to be themselves. And I say that as someone in a riding where my MP is 1,000% going to vote to support this, my Liberal MP.
No, who's your MP?
Jennifer O'Connell. She's been fairly... Day one, she struck a fairly neutral tone. By day two, she didn't have such a neutral tone. I generally like Jennifer O'Connell. I've supported her even though I'm not a Liberal. But, you know, she lost my vote over this. This is a pretty big deal.
I was just going to say, Ellen, I think, look, the Liberals caucus is actually quite flexible on a free vote for rank and file, right? So rank and file, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you're going to do. They have, I think, an internal rule. You have to let the party know if you're going to vote against the government, right? With a certain.
And you're talking backbenchers, not cabinet ministers.
Yeah, backbenchers, rank and file folks. Now, cabinet ministers is a different question. And I think if we see a cabinet minister vote against the government and a stated government policy, all bets are off, right? That means that there was an internal conversation. Will they be allowed to vote their conscience? Likely, the prime minister won't show up for this vote. That's what I think we'll see. He just won't be there, which would not be out of line for contentious votes where they're worried about government policy and being undermined. One thing that's really understated on this and on the unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood is Hamas's goal with October 7th and all of the aftermath has been to claim the mantle of the PLO, right? Which they have been locked out of because they refuse to recognize Israeli sovereignty. This gives legitimacy to Hamas in a way that positions them for leadership of the PLO. And it undermines the Palestinian Authority, which we have a relationship with, which I'm sure we'll discuss the photo that was taken. We have a relationship with them, right? They are the sovereign leadership of the Palestinian people. They run.
We have a mission, a foreign mission, right, in Ramallah, and they sent their ambassador to Ottawa, and so we recognize the Palestinian Authority.
So not only should Canadians be worried about this, Palestinian Authority should be worried about this.
Okay, so they had a non-binding motion on genocide in general when they talked about the Uyghurs.
Yep, I remember that.
with China a year and a half to 2 years ago. Maybe we forget because we had the pandemic, we had the other war in 2021, but it was around that time. Same thing, but it's a symbol. And I want to talk about symbols because everyone in the Canadian Jewish world has seen this tweet with photos of Yara Sachs and Melanie Joly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Israeli-Canadian cabinet minister, holding hands. Well, one wasn't, with Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. So let's start with you, Anthony. What reaction did you have when you saw that tweet?
Part of me was shocked, but part of me, based on my experience with Yara in the past, I was less shocked, I think, than some other people might have been. No disrespect to Minister Sachs, but she has a bit of a reputation of really seeing herself as being the smartest person in the room because she worked for the mayor of Jerusalem for 5 minutes, and this experience, made her the absolute expert on all things related to the Israeli peace process. It's also no secret that she's definitely on the left wing of the Jewish community, specifically as it applies to this question and other ones. But again, and it's funny, I saw a lot of Liberal Party activists and otherwise, both in the community, but in particular outside of the community, sharing a series of photos of, Stephen Harper shaking hands with Mahmoud Abbas and all these different things. And to those people, all I'd say is that, first of all, context really matters, as this whole conversation it's an exercise in stressing the importance of context, and this in particular too. One, the post-October 7th world is very different than the pre-October 7th world. And Mahmoud Abbas, the Fatah has been very inconsistent in their comments on this. They've at times tried to demonize Hamas, and they'll legitimize them, but at the same time avoid overly demonizing the actions that occurred on October 7th. So there's two things. One, post-October 7th, horrific. We're talking about a guy who is still a Holocaust denier, who got his PhD on a thesis that was written explicitly denying the details of the Holocaust. To somebody who presides over an administration that provides pay for killing of Jews to terrorists. Now, this was all true before October 7th, but the most important thing, I think it's something that's important. Yara Sachs is a Jew. And she's an Israeli, okay? And some people want to say that doesn't matter, that it shouldn't matter because she's a Canadian minister. I'm one of the people who say that it does. Sorry. It absolutely does. You're the first Israeli-Canadian minister in Canadian history. You are a Jew. By all accounts, you're a proud Jew. How you can take that picture in that way. That's the other thing, too. You know what? Someone made this comment, and I agree. If it would have been a different kind of picture, they're sitting at a desk, face-to-face, stern-faced, having conversations, whatever. Okay. But to stand next to him, caress his arm in his hand, and give a nice smile for the camera? No. Sorry. And then it got even worse. The backlash was so horrific from the community, then she felt compelled to release that 5-tweet thread the following day, which in my opinion just made it worse. So no, that's sort of my take. Post-October 7th, different world, and also, you're a Jew, and you're an Israeli, and to take that picture at that time, in this context, I think at the very least, very poor optics. And I think anybody who would have taken 5 minutes to just ask that question of, how would this look, would be able to realize. And that's the last thing I'll say on this. The reason that it frustrates me too, and I'm very conscious of this in my actions as a political actor in Canada, as a Jew, and as a visible Jew, and as a proud Jew, I don't allow myself to be used as a prop. And the fact that they brought her and had her in that meeting and made sure that she was included in that picture, I think was deliberate. And I think it was a way to provide themselves with a certain degree of cover, whether they're going to say that explicitly or not, but it's like, look, we've got the Israeli Jew cabinet minister who's taking the picture as well, so it's not that big of a deal. It's not bad.
So I agree 1,000% that it was done very deliberately to have her in that room. I think we see a lot of that in the whole Israel versus Palestine fight. It's not anti-Semitic because there are Jews who support this cause. And we've got some real problems with tokenism right now, where this tiny minority of Jews suddenly make something okay that the vast majority are not okay with. Because, I have a friend and they're Jewish and they say this is okay, so clearly it's okay. And I think that's why they pull out Yara Sachs and put her there. And, as far as that photo goes, my initial reaction was the same as yours, that gut punch. And then, whereas before my question was about the how, this time it's about the why. And I think the reason why that photo exists is that they're thinking about what happens the day after the war. And if it's not going to be Hamas, who is it going to be? And I think they're looking at this as the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because there's got to be someone there. And so they've made it clear who they think is that is going to be, whether or not that's the case. They're starting to form allies with who they think will be the next leaders if Israel succeeds in their mission. And I think that's why the picture was taken. And I think that's the statement that they're conveying, or at least it's the message that I took away.
Okay, Joe, I want to bring you in because one of the things the audience may not know is that you are very close. We're very close to Yara. I don't know if you still are,
Sure.
Sachs, and may even help tell me about the fundraiser that you arranged with her, and then the special guest shows up.
I recognize and I understand the visceral reaction that people had when they saw that photo. What Mahmoud Abbas represents to, especially in the post-October 7th world, to Anthony's point, is not the same thing that he represented pre-October 7th. So that's definitely understandable. But I also think, and I will talk about the fundraiser in just a second, but I think, look, Yara Sachs has been working doggedly to get this government to engage on issues in Israel-Palestine for her entire tenure in the House of Commons. You know, she was trying to get senior members of parliament and the cabinet to visit the region last year, long before any of this happened. This is not, you know, so it makes complete sense to me that she would be there, that she would accompany Melanie Joly across her tour of both Israel and the Palestinian territories. When I saw the picture, I wasn't mad at Yara. You know, she was there. It looks like he grabbed her wrist. I mean, I don't want to make assumptions about what the context was. It's like, man, I wish you had folded your arms or something. But how is she supposed to know that the guy's going to grab her wrist when they snap the photo? What I was angry about was that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs released the photo. They put it out there. They threw her to the wolves. They knew what the reaction from the Jewish community would be. And they said, no, you know what? It's worth it to us to have her in this photo. And it helps us to achieve our political goal, which is to play the domestic politics game and to appease both sides, which they've done a terrible job of doing. Everyone's angry at them. And frankly, you know, I think she'll continue doing what she has been doing, which is fighting for an Israel that she wants to see as an Israeli, right? Yeah, she is there under the context of the Canadian government, but she's also there to provide insight and context to this government to how they see Israel. And I think that's important and something we have to give her credit for.
Okay, go back. Tell me about this fundraiser that you did. And
yeah, look, I mean, I think during the judicial reform, judicial overhaul, judicial coup, however you want to phrase it, the ancient history of that.
Talking about in Israel. Yeah.
In Israel, yes. There was a lot of conversation in the Jewish community on the liberal Zionist progressive movement of, can we actually help these politicians that we think could be allies in this conversation and that have spoken out? Yara issued a statement. I think she was the only Jewish member of parliament that issued a statement opposing the judicial overhaul. And so, you know, we organized, me and a couple of other folks organized a fundraiser to support her, right? Fearing that some folks on the right side of the Jewish community may try to penalize her for that statement and for pushing that out. And look, I think who's more important in that conversation in a Canadian context than the Minister of Foreign Affairs? So Melanie Joly came in and was the guest that evening. And we had a robust crowd, is what I would say, and had a lot of really meaningful conversation about Canadian policy and how Canada relates to Israel, what the peace process could and should look like, which is very different than maybe what this motion that we talked about at the beginning of this program is.
I remember in May of last summer, the Israeli embassy had a policy conference in Ottawa. I was there, as maybe some of you guys were. I know you were there. They had panel discussions, and Yara I clearly interviewed her because she wanted to push for the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons to revisit Canada's relationship with the Israel-Palestine question. And I did a whole story about it. So like you said, this isn't out of character for her. The timing makes it different. What I do want to ask, though, is what do you make of the fact that Melanie Joly said while she was there that they were finally going to put $1 million towards funding to investigate sexual violence against women in Israel? And then they did the same thing for Palestinian women, which they didn't say by who, but obviously it's by prison guards and Israeli Defense Force people. Emma, do you want to start?
Yeah. So as far as the $1 million towards Israeli victims of sexual abuse, I say fantastic, but where have you been since October? Why is this happening now? You know, there's so much therapy that these women could have already used, because when the trauma is fresh, that's the time you need the most healing. We're very delayed on this. And the fact that around the world, people are still denying that violence even happened, having the government step in. And it's really unfortunate that we need the government to give credibility to the voices of women speaking their experiences, but it doesn't hurt. And so I'm glad that they're finally acknowledging that this is in fact something that happened in a way that's going to get people to pay attention. We should always believe women. As far as giving it to Palestine, I don't object to that myself. If women there are victims of sexual violence, then by all means, help them in any way possible. They don't deserve it. Israelis don't deserve it. Nobody deserves it.
However, the United Nations rapporteur, that was Pramila Patten, that just came out with her report 3 weeks ago about sexual violence in Israel and sexual violence among detainees, could not prove it, had no evidence. It was just reports by stakeholders and for detainees that there was some inappropriate behavior. Never, I mean, I'm not trying to say any parsing. There was no rape. It was threats of rape and making them walk around without hijabs on, things like that, or threatening to rape their mothers or things like that.
So what are they playing this? So this is the point. This is what frustrates me, and this has been true for a lot of what's gone on since October 7th. Any Israeli, whether it's IDF, whether it's prison guard, whether it's whatever, okay, who is found to have sexually abused in one way or another anybody, be it Palestinian or what have you, should be tried, charged, and imprisoned to the full extent of the law. Throw the book at these people. What I take issue with is that the only time the Canadian government and others felt comfortable even talking in hushed tones about the sexual violence experienced by Israeli women on October 7th and since was when they could very quickly balance it out, when it became a both sides sort of issue, where it sounds like, okay, well, we're not overly condemning. Now we can condemn sexual violence in the conflict in general, right? When the reports were only coming from one side, when it was only Israeli women that were talking about this, we didn't talk about it. It was still unsubstantiated. And like you said, just this morning, I had a lifelong friend, somebody that I care and love for very much. I was even at their wedding, who shared an Instagram reel saying that it had been debunked and that none of this was actually true and that it was fabricated by, Israelis and stuff like that. Very upsetting. And again, man.
What was debunked? The Hamas rapes.
Yeah. Then there was all, the Israelis were just trying to get a casus belli and justification for their, supposed genocide in Gaza. It's just irritating that it only happens whenever there's an Israeli accusation or evidence of something bad happening to Israelis first. Even the people who will concede that Hamas did bad things, this is what you'll get. Take this example because it's the one we're talking about. Israeli women were raped on October 7th. Yes, but the IDF rapes Palestinian women all the time. And it's like, first of all, that's not true. Second of all, it's the back and forth. Nothing can be done to Israelis without the immediate response being, yes, but the Israelis do bad things too.
Whataboutism, right.
There's this sort of notion that there's certain people on the progressive side of the political spectrum in particular who are uncomfortable with recognizing or speaking to the atrocities committed against Israelis and the suffering inflicted upon Israelis without very quickly being, or even in the Canadian context, talking about anti-Semitism, without very quickly also making a reference to the Palestinian side or the Islamophobic side. And I think that's curious. I think it's deserving of investigation. But from the Jewish perspective, I think also very frustrating. Okay, because...
Well, it's about votes, is it not?
Oh, well, listen, guys, at the end of the day, I'm gonna say something that might be very unpopular.
There's more of them.
Precisely. There's way more of them than there are of us. And by all indications, the demographics are trending for that to become even more so the case moving forward. The fact of the matter is the Liberal Party of Canada, I said, they're not evil. They're just self-interested. So that's what it is.
I talked about being domestic politics, right? And how they're trying to play domestic politics. And Anthony's point, that's what they're trying to do here.
Okay. I have two more things I want to quickly talk about. Number one, why hasn't Justin Trudeau gone to Israel yet?
Domestic politics. I'll go back to this, right? And I think he's the only G7 leader besides the Prime Minister of Japan who has not been. So of all of the Western, he's definitely the only, I think he's the only NATO leader who hasn't been at this point. There was a decision made. That wasn't happen. His schedule wasn't too busy, right? There was a reason he's not going, and it was a domestic political play. They're looking at the numbers, to Anthony's point, and saying, we know riding by riding what the demographics are, how many votes we need in which ridings, and we're making a choice. We're going to let others take that torch. We're going to let Melanie Joly go there on behalf of the government so I can maintain distance. There's just no other way to look at this. And I think as a Canadian Jew, it's so disheartening that our PM is the only one.
He's gone to Ukraine twice, 3 times. Anthony, you're waving.
I think what it comes down to is there was a calculation that was made to say, it's funny, a very smart politician who's a very big mentor of mine who will remain unnamed gave me a very good piece of advice when I was younger. There's only one thing that a fence sitter gets, and that's a sore expletive, okay? Bottom. And I think Mr. Trudeau finds himself in this situation where he's aggravating everybody. So it's funny. The pro-Palestine, whatever you want to call them, the protests that are going on, they're calling him Genocide Justin, just like they're calling Joe Biden Genocide Joe. The Jewish community's upset because we feel, broadly speaking, he hasn't done enough. Why hasn't he gone to Israel? Why is he the only one? While the other side is still treating him, as if he's personally sanctioning wanton massacre of innocent Palestinian civilians. I want to make clear, that's not what the IDF is doing.
There's the whole thing I'm going to throw in there. The government did slow the permits or halted permits of non-lethal and military parts to Israel.
After the fake pause on UNRWA payments, right? The pause for a payment that was reversed before the payment could even not be sent. Wonderful. But I think at the end of the day, and it's funny, if I put my political advisor hat on for a moment, I don't think it's a good idea for Justin Trudeau to go politically. He pisses everybody off because no matter what he does, both sides are going to be looking for that sign of bias or favoritism towards one side or another. Nobody's going to be satisfied. So like you said, you send the Yara Saxes, you send the Melanie Jolys of the world over there. They take the brunt of the criticism one way or another. And it keeps a very, very damaged prime minister. I think we can all, regardless of whether we like him or not doing so hot right now politically. I think it prevents him from getting an even deeper wound at a time when he can't really afford to have many more.
This is one of those things, you either do it today or you don't do it at all. And he did not do it in a timely manner. At this point, it comes off as fake. There's just no other way to look at it, right? He shouldn't go now. I think we would all prefer if he just stays home.
Great.
And lastly, Emma, what are you watching for now in terms of the photo op and this vote in the House of Commons? Who gets hurt? Political careers. Is this the end for Yara Sachs? Is she done in her writing now because Roman Baber's going to take over? Is this going to hurt Marco Mendicino, Anthony Housefather?
I'm thinking about BC and what we just saw with Selena Robinson. And do I think what she said about pre-Israel Palestine was appropriate? Absolutely not. I think that was a pretty unfortunate thing for her to say. But I think, she took responsibility and she immediately started to take steps to learn to do better. And the government shut her down and forced her to resign, essentially. And I don't know that we won't see more of that, because I think no matter what happens next, Jews get hurt. And whether that's Jews like us or whether that's Jews in the government, either way, at the end of the rope, that's where I think we are. I think we get hurt.
What do you think, Anthony? Whose careers are finished or on the line, if anything, because of these photo ops and what have you?
Yeah, I think Minister Sachs is done like dinner. I think, polling was already, her writing was already going to be quite tough. York Centre is one of those that tends to vote with the government, and Ontario has been observing a pretty solid swing towards the Conservatives. Obviously, there's many things that can happen between now and the next election. And I can say as a Conservative that, Lord knows my party knows how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I'd say Anthony Housefather, who, by the way, I want to put full disclosure, me and him have a very good personal relationship. I admire some of the courage that he's had to speak out independently, him and Marco. The problem is, man, at a certain point, enough's got to be enough. If you're opposing the government on everything that they're doing, it stands to reason, like, why are you still a member of this party? So, love you, Anthony. Want to see you do well. Appreciate what you've done for the community. But at a certain point, this is the new Liberal Party. The Liberal Party that you used to know, that you used to love, that you used to appreciate doesn't exist anymore. Time to come to terms with that. And I suspect, once again, after this vote on Monday, depending on how it goes, he's going to have some very, very difficult choices to make. And all I'll say, Mount Royal has traditionally been the only riding on the island of Montreal where the Conservatives have any much of a choice. If you see 2008, 2011, and then even in 2015, there was a very strong Conservative presence there. Not as strong in 2019, 2021, but internal polling is showing that it is very, very much in play. What used to be arguably the safest Liberal seat in the country, Pierre-Louis Trudeau represented it for many, many years in Mount Royal. Erwin Calder represented it and at one point was winning it with 90% of the vote. Those days are long gone. I think his career partisan-wise, but also just his personal standing, he's got a lot of respect in the community in Montreal and nationally, but a lot of people, even who used to consider themselves relatively solid Liberals, I think are looking at Anthony and saying, listen, brother, what's going on? Like, at a certain point, enough's got to be enough, and you've got to take that step. The course of the next month and a half to 2 months, with motions like the one coming on Monday, are going to be very, very definitive, I think, in particular for Mr. Housefather's career. With regards to Mrs. Bendayan, I know she's been recovering from some health issues. I wish her nothing but the best. I think that's kind of given her a little bit of cover in terms of the fact that she's been a little bit more quiet. I think she'll probably be safe, all things considered. But it's not a good time to be a Jew on the progressive side of the political aisle as an elected official right now.
Or as Joe has discovered, as a NGO person too, which is why you left.
That's true.
Is there any last things that you want our listeners to understand about the significance of political in Canada at this juncture? Like, what's at stake for our community?
I want to say one thing, and I think just to respond to Anthony in a way and what was just said. At the end of the day, the buck stops with the leader. We have one leader in this country. It's the Prime Minister. He's making these decisions. He made a decision to refund UNRWA, an organization that allegedly is complicit in the murder of 8 Canadian citizens on October 7th. He will have to pay for that. And all of those members of the Liberal caucus will pay for his choices, right? So it doesn't matter where they are. There will be some that are in very safe ridings, but not many is what it's looking like. He is where the buck stops. That's it. And so a lot of people are going to be looking to him, and we'll be looking to him on Monday. We'll say, where are you and where is your leadership? And what does that mean for my Canadian values and how I view myself as a Canadian in this world?
We'll watch what happens, and maybe we'll have you back when the budget comes out.
Thanks so much for having us, Ellen.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, sponsored by Metropia. Integrity, community, quality, and customer care. We'll be monitoring the vote in Parliament for you on Monday. It begins around lunchtime Eastern Time. And remember, the vote is non-binding, but it's symbolic. Just 3 months ago, Hamas thanked Canada for its support of a non-binding UN ceasefire resolution. And Mahmoud Abbas thanked Canada last week for funding UNRWA again. Prime Minister Trudeau has visited Israel once since he came to power nearly 9 years ago. It was in 2016 for the funeral of former Israeli President Shimon Peres. Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and most of Western Europe do not yet recognize Palestine as a state, although they have a diplomatic mission here and we have one in Ramallah. About 130 countries in the UN already recognize Palestine. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'm at ebessner@thecjn.ca. And as always, thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.